So let's take a deep dive on the Warhammer 40K 10th edition datasheets. We've got a new stat, a whole bunch of things moved around, AP being decreased, and so many things that are staples on datasheets being completely gone. Let's take a look over them and see what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking 10th edition, and perhaps one of the biggest reveals of last night's preview were these new datasheets that we have. They showed off a new one for Tyranid Termagants, talked us through the various changes that we might expect, and there's a fair few other things hiding here that perhaps wasn't immediately obvious. I thought we could talk through the datasheet bit by bit, look at the weird second version of the same datasheet that they also seem to have published, and start to get a grip as to how our models might be playing in the new game. First up, redoing all the datasheets is something that they don't do every time they have a new edition in Warhammer 40k. For the most part, they didn't really tend to do that sort of thing at all from 4th edition all the way through to 7th. The core rulebook would be replaced, but the datasheets wouldn't actually be updated, and that did kind of limit exactly what they could do design-wise going from one edition to the next. That changed in quite a major way going into Warhammer 40k 8th, which stayed for 9th, and as it looks like the transition from 9th to 10th is a full index reset, they've been able to go through every single datasheet and make some fundamental changes to the game based on those. They can't really do these sort of things every single edition, as otherwise you wind up with banks of tables needed if you want to make datasheet changes, as they did when, say, they applied the blast weapon to certain units. There really are quite a lot of changes here. Maybe the headline things that are here are many attack stats being moved on to the actual weapon profiles for the unit, less lethality throughout 40k in general, particularly to AP, a new stat called OC or Objective Control, a bunch of new datasheet special rules, and perhaps most tellingly a whole bunch of things that aren't here, including things like power level and unit size and war gear choices. Let's go through things one by one in the Termagant datasheet though. Here we have our 40k datasheet, maybe not too dissimilar from what it's looked like before. Less stats on the top block, maybe a few more on the weapon profiles, nothing at all in terms of war gear or unit size, and then some abilities and faction keywords. Going through things bit by bit, for the core stats of the unit, we still have our normal movement, toughness, saves and wounds. They don't really seem to have changed, but anything related to the model actually dealing damage has moved down here to the weapon profiles. It means that weapon skill and ballistic skill are down there now, and it does mean that they could vary weapon by weapon, so say you could have a Space Marine who's got a Power Fist and a Power Sword, the Power Fist might hit on 4s and the Power Sword on 3s. That seems fairly simple and intuitive. The strength of ranged weapons was usually on the weapons profile itself, but now it looks like the strength of even basic melee weapons have moved down there as well, rather than the model having a core strength stat on its profile. Termagants don't really have any major close combat weapons, so I feel like this one's just a placeholder for their standard attack that they would have got otherwise. They've called it Xenos Claws and Teeth, giving you a single hit at strength 3. The other bit that's moved down here is the attacks characteristic. Now we have an attacks profile both for the ranged weapons and for the melee weapons. The attack profile for the ranged weapons, I guess, is just how many shots it gets normally. It looks like they've broken that away from, say, the assault rule or the rapid fire rule. I think it will be interesting to see units that get multiple different close combat weapons though, and how they work out breaking it down between those two attacks. Maybe you have to select one melee weapon to fight with or another. Another change to the top stat line is the leadership characteristic. This is now an 8+ for Termagants apparently. Previously it was lower than this. It does kind of imply that the entire morale phase has been rewritten. They said that there was going to be some sort of command phase check for whether or not the unit is broken. The fact that they've got a plus on this statistic means that it looks like you'll be rolling against it. I don't know whether it's going to be the usual thing of take a certain amount of casualties and then test morale, or whether we might be going back to some sort of 2d6 versus leadership system as we've often had in the past. I can't help but think that a leadership 8 probably isn't going to be amazing for Termagants when they're on their own. They're kind of known for being fairly fearful unless they have synapse creatures overriding them and making them fearless. The new stat on the datasheet is OC, which I believe stands for Objective Control. Termagants have an OC of 2, and I believe that would be per model. I'm not sure if they 100% specifically spelled it out when they did their reveal stream or anything, but I feel like the system is likely to be if you have more points of OC on an objective, then you control it. So say if you had 10 Termagants with OC2, you'd have 20 points on that objective compared with whatever your opponent had. They then mentioned that other creatures and war machines would have different OC values. Say for example Imperial Knights would get a lot because they're big and stompy. Games Workshop generally like to have troops controlling objectives where possible, so it seems that anything that had objectives secured and was troops before, like these termagants, will get a boosted value, which is probably why these have 2 rather than 1. I feel like this is a pretty sensible way to do it, to be honest. You don't have automatically one troop's choice holding an objective in retrospect of an entire massive elites unit fighting off against them. It always felt a bit weird when you had, say, an entire Terminator squad on an objective, but the enemy had a couple of Orc boys, and somehow they won the objective due to being troops and reasons. I feel like with this system it might make a bit more intuitive sense in game, even if it might be a little bit more adding up. Another thing that was notable in the preview is that apparently AP is going to be reduced a fair bit. Games Workshop have been gradually buffing a whole bunch of units to have more and more AP as 8th and 9th edition came out. Just about every major faction small arm had wound up getting AP-1 bar the very weediest things. And here we've got an example of that being reversed, the Tyranid Fleshborg having basically the same stats as it did before, but it's now AP0, not AP-1. Probably sensible, to be honest. I feel like that was one criticism of 9th edition. AP had maybe been applied just a little bit too liberally, so high saves didn't really matter all that much, unless you had some sort of big stacking rule like Armour of Contempt when it was a thing. Next up, it looks like the weapon's type has been baked in alongside the weapon's name. I feel like actually one of the most interesting things about this stat line is that the Termagant Devourer doesn't appear to have any sort of associated rules with it. It's neither listed as an assault weapon nor a rapid fire or anything like that. Games Workshop might just be giving us basic issue shooting attacks without feeling the need to give everything, say, rapid fire, assault, or heavy. I feel like this is probably sensible enough, to be honest. Some guns are probably easy enough to move and fire without being able to be hurtling along into combat. We kind of had this before with the Leagues of Votan Hunter weapons. Weirdly, they needed a special rule to neither be assault nor heavy weapons, just basic things that you can move and fire without penalty. Otherwise, it looks like the melee weapons don't have any sort of type listed by them. The Fleshborer remains assault, nothing new there I guess, but the Spine Fists again are pretty interesting. They're both assault weapons and pistols, which is something that you wouldn't be able to do in current Warhammer 40k rules. I guess that means that you'd be able to move and fire them as if they were assault weapons, and I suspect that they'd also get the pistol rule for firing them in combat. It appears that we've also got the return of the Twin Links rule in some way. In past editions that allowed you to re-roll the hit roll. No idea if that's going to remain being the case in 10th edition, but this could be really quite a major shake-up for a bunch of units in the game. There's lots of weapons that basically have 2 barrels and get double the number of shots, loads of twin las cannons or twin heavy bolters out there, which this could be a pretty major change for, either for the positive or negative. Next up, it looks like the special rule section is now to the side of the datasheet rather than below it. In this section, the termagants are kept fairly simple. We've got the faction ability, which is Synapse, which I guess is going to remain for the Tyranids. I suspect to be somewhat similar to how it is at the moment. Try and keep in range and you'll be able to be fearless, otherwise you'll be having some sort of instinctive behaviour. This might be the sort of thing that they flesh out a bit more when they have codexes. I feel like the index rules that they get are probably going to be fairly simple and basic. Then it appears that they've got a datasheet ability. From the way that they were talking about it in their previews, it sounds like just about every single unit in the game will now have a datasheet ability of some sort. I think this is perhaps their idea to keep a fair bit of flavour in the game while not having everything farmed out to stratagems. It means that there's more pressure on the datasheets and less on your page of special rules and your big box of tricks to pull out of. The Termagants one actually looks like a fairly powerful rule called Skulking Horrors. Once per turn, when an enemy unit ends a normal advance or fall back move within 9 inches of them, if this unit isn't in combat, it can then make a normal move of d6 inches, potentially backpedaling away from an assault, or even potentially moving out of line of sight, or moving up to move or charge block the enemy. I guess we might get a bit more clarification as to the once per turn thing in the core rules potentially. I don't think there's really anything here that implies that you can't do it on multiple units each turn, but I guess there might be something relating to abilities that means it's just the one unit. Either way, this one looks pretty powerful and could be a bit of a gotcha moment if the opponent isn't aware of this. Though I guess it's something that's innate to termagants, so you should be able to expect it each time that you face them, as opposed to just being one option amongst many. Then looking at the bottom of the datasheet, we've got the keywords. The faction keyword section has been simplified quite a bit, mercifully. We have things like Hive Tendril, Tyranids, Hive Fleet Choice, and plenty of other things here. This one's been simplified down to just merely Tyranids. I guess perhaps the biggest and most obvious omission out of this one is that there's no sort of choose your own Hive Fleet type thing. As I kind of suspected, it looks like things like individual high fleet rules might well be drastically reined in, at least in indexes, and who knows how much they'll actually be coming back in codexes. Then for the unit keywords, they have infantry, which you'd expect, Great Devourer, which I'd guess is still something Tyranid related overall, Endless Multitude, which is the one that they have at the moment in the Tyranid Codex, that denotes the swarms, so it might be something that you can target certain datasheet abilities on, or maybe stratagems, and the keyword for termagants themselves. Maybe another notable omission here is that they don't appear to be core. That might be a thing that's just entirely gone in the new edition, or they might target it around other things like the battle line keyword, which apparently might not be on the datasheet. Speaking of which, I feel like we learn just about as much for the things that aren't on this datasheet as opposed to the things that are. First up, there's neither points nor power level here. I was wondering if Games Workshop are thinking about going fully digital. Might they well put the points on the datasheet, at least for the digital download, even if they didn't have it for their cards? Might have been an opportunity to take a leaf out of Warhapedia's book there, but at the moment it doesn't look like it. It sounds like they're going to be kept separately in their own document or reference sheet somewhere else, either in the codex or online. They did say that they were going to make an army builder to launch with 10th edition. Fingers crossed this one is actually functional now. And if it is actually usable, they might have that as the main way that you access points. I guess that will be one big incentive to use it. With this datasheet, it does look possible that it could be the end of power level. Normally power level is included on the Warhammer 40K datasheet, as sort of like a quick start thing to put an army together, but Games Workshop might be finally getting rid of it and just going back to all in on points as they had before. My guess is that points costs are going to be pretty vastly simplified. If they do have a whole load less options for things like war gear and stuff like that, then it might kind of remove the need for power level if it's fairly simple to build things in points anyway. I know some people do like power level, but I can't say I miss it enormously myself. I've just never really found it that much effort to add up a few points costs, at least not since they moved away from that slightly annoying system in 8th edition where they put all the war gear on a separate page to the actual unit. The other bits that are kind of missing from this are a couple of interesting bits like the number of models in the unit and anything to denote the battlefield role that this unit falls into. I guess it's not 100% impossible that this could be a preview datasheet that isn't entirely complete, but I'd guess that's less likely seeing as it looks really quite polished, plus it does list the equipment for the different weapon options like Flesh Borers, Spine Fists, and the Devourer. I feel like there's a good chance that 40k could go down the Age of Sigmar route with this sort of thing, rather than have the number of units that you can have on the datasheet, have a bit of an army building section for the codex. That will give you an option for the unit's maximum and minimum size, how many points it costs per model, and then also have any battlefield role tags that the unit might need denoted there. Like in Age of Sigmar, you can have things that are battle line, and you can take more of those than the other choices. Games Workshop have said with their army construction that things are getting a whole load simpler, so force organization chart slots might be just gone for good in any respect. Apparently you pick your warlord, then 3 units of each type, and then up to 6 of each battle line unit. I think that we would need to see the fine print on that a little bit. I don't know if each type would mean just literally every single datasheet, or if they might have some broad overarching things like they might still fall into heavy support or fast attack or something, or have more grouped types like say fast vehicles or tanks, which maybe you might be weighing up one or the other. In any case, based on what's missing from this datasheet, I feel like the counterpart to this will probably be an Age of Sigmar army building page example, much like this. Lastly, for major things that are missing, as mentioned, there's no section here for how many units can take what sort of weapons within the squad, and I guess that might again be in the army building section as opposed to on the datasheet perhaps small addendums to the unit saying that the champion can take this, this or this, and if those war gear options cost anything additionally. I'm really not too sure exactly what they're going to go down with this kind of rule, but I feel like there's a very good chance we might be seeing a massive farm out of the free war gear special rules that we've had throughout 9th edition. Gradually more and more units getting their war gear costed completely free, with only major things costing a little bit extra. I think with these datasheets being rewritten the way that they are, there's a pretty strong chance that we might be getting that across all of Warhammer 40k going forward. It could possibly apply to literally every single datasheet, and then try and balance the power of the weapons so they're at least somewhat worth it over each other. I feel like with free war gear though, you're probably going to go down a route where a lot of things are kind of redundant as they are at the moment, though admittedly that often seems to happen if they do charge points for each bit of gear as well. There will often tend to be a best way to run the unit even if they try and balance things up with a points cost. Then perhaps one of the most interesting things was that Games Workshop has actually shown us off a different version of the Termagant datasheet. The first one that we've been looking at was uploaded to their Warhammer community page in a bit better detail. This one was actually shown off in the middle of their stream, and it's got a few rather big differences on it. Altered abilities, keywords, stats, war gear, and interestingly it looks like the ability to mix in rippers with the main unit. The ripper stats maybe aren't so different from how they are currently. Their toughness is only 2, they've got a save of 5 plus but 4 wounds, and they make 4 attacks hitting on 5s with a strength of 2, no AP and damage 1. My guess would be that this is going to be a variant datasheet that's aimed at a specific box set, maybe the launch box for 40K 10th edition, or perhaps even a Combat Patrol datasheet. Games Workshop had mentioned that the Combat Patrol version of the game will get some slightly different rules to try and balance the forces of the box sets against each other. It's interesting to see that there are a fair amount of differences otherwise besides just the addition of rippers here. The Termagants can't take anything else besides the Flesh Borer, plus they're for some reason their leadership 9+, which I don't know whether that's better or worse. Judging by their current datasheet, I guess it would probably be worse. Maybe it's a pass morale check if you manage to roll over that, and maybe you might have some sort of modifiers like add the number left in the squad. There really are a fair few ways that they could go with morale. Otherwise, it's a bit weird that the Termagant leadership's a bit different, and also that their abilities are quite heavily changed as well. They've got something called Lurking Behaviour, giving the units the benefit of cover when they're near objectives, and also apparently the Rippers have to tank the damage for the Termagants as well. They get hit first as their lesser organisms rule. This would also imply that the unit's a mixed toughness unit as well. Those things can often be a bit awkward to resolve attacks against. In 9th edition, a lot of things that have the same unit profile often have the same toughness arbitrarily, so it's a bit weird to see the Rippers having less here. Finally, there's also fewer keywords on this one, no endless multitudes. Again, it makes me think that this is probably a targeted datasheet for a box set, such as the launch box, or maybe for the Combat Patrol game mode. Finally, for other things besides what we can actually see on this datasheet, they did mention a few things that are going to be common trends in 40k on different datasheets besides the Termagants. One of the biggest changes is that the toughness stat is going to increase. Currently the highest levels are usually around about toughness 8 or 9 for most things. It was quite a big deal when say the Rogue or Dawn tank or the Chaos Space Marine Lander Raider got toughness 9, meaning that quite a lot of mid-strength weapons like missile launchers or melter wouldn't work on them quite so well. Now apparently they confirmed that the toughest vehicles in the game will have a toughness of 12 or potentially more. I'd guess that this will probably be the things that are also toughest at the moment, so look at things like Rogue or Dawns and Land Raiders and expect them to go up a bit. Overall the aim is to have mid-strength things being a little bit less universal, and for really powerful weapons to be needed to take down the biggest tanks and armoured vehicles. It sounds like the aim is a bit like in earlier editions of Warhammer 40k, to try and make sure that you actually need dedicated anti-tank weapons to take down the very toughest stuff, rather than having tanks spammed to death by things like Avenger Gatling cannons maybe for Imperial Knights, or mid-strength plasma attacks, which should ideally be better at killing elite infantry. All of that's maybe a little bit speculative at the moment. We don't know if they might change the to wound chart in some major way, which might mean that toughness values mean a completely different thing. Otherwise, as we touched on earlier, the unit abilities will be a bit different. Lots of abilities are going to be on the datasheets instead of stratagems, and they said that several abilities are going to be single use per turn abilities, even if you've got multiple copies of the same datasheet in your army. It wasn't too clear whether or not the Termagant one would count as that, but they did specifically call out Space Marine captains as having a buff that if you've got one Space Marine captain they can use it, but if you've got two Space Marine captains, only one of them will be able to choose to. This seems like a potentially interesting way to encourage a bit of unit diversity and not spamming things too much. I'm sure plenty of things will be efficient enough that you want to take them in multiples, but in general it can be just a bit more interesting to have a good variety of units on the table, promotes a bit more complex interactions rather than just choosing to shoot multiple copies of the same thing. Those reactive abilities I think are interesting and sound a bit engaging, but I must admit have me just a little bit apprehensive. I feel like if your opponent's got a whole bunch of units that you haven't played with too regularly, then their reactive abilities might just be a whole bunch of gotcha moves that can catch you out if you're not expecting them to do certain things. Say for example with those Tyrannid Termagants, I must admit, unless you knew that they had that ability, then you probably wouldn't think twice about moving units near them. You might be quite disappointed when you set up a unit for a long charge and they just run straight back and make your charge impossible. If your opponent didn't know that that ability was on the datasheet, then that would be a bit of a feels bad movement for them, as they would have played very differently if they knew that you had it. Obviously, it's easy enough to learn for any one unit in the enemy army, but when you're playing Warhammer 40k with 20 plus factions you might be facing, there's going to be a lot of that presumably. Finally, in terms of how these datasheets are actually going to be delivered, apparently these are going to be digitally downloadable or available as a portable cards deck, kind of similar to Age of Sigmar, physical cards that you can actually buy. Though I do think it's a very nice move that Games Workshop isn't immediately charging you to play 10th edition 40k, particularly as it goes hand in hand with them replacing all the codexes. It does sound like they will be issuing their own 10th edition codexes after they start coming out. I'm sure you will have to pay for them as per normal, and there will be some rules that are kind of locked to the codex as opposed to available for free. I'd be surprised if Games Workshop ditch the codex model altogether, seeing as it's quite a good source of revenue for them. But hopefully this should mean that the general get you by type rules will remain playable throughout the edition, even without any supplemental content like the codexes. I guess they might add in some extra things like sub-factions and different ways to play your army, like certain formations. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a bit of a muse about Warhammer 40k datasheets and how they might be working for us in 10th edition. Let me know your thoughts on any of the new stats or the changes that we've seen, how they might impact the way that our units play, and certainly if there's any implications I might have missed about this, I'll try and update things with pinned comments if there's anything too important. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'll certainly be keeping up with all the news of 10th edition Warhammer. I have a feeling that Games Workshop's going to be keeping the news coming pretty thick and fast. Finally, if you have been enjoying or finding all of these updates useful, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which is the thing that allows me to do this as my main thing, and talk about 40k quite so much on the internet. If you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.